Reddit thread was buried under 40-something replies and I almost missed it. My phone was at 12% and the cheap IKEA lamp on my desk was doing the thing where it flickered every few minutes without actually going out. And I was tired enough that I had been scrolling for about an hour without reading anything. The post had no title, just a username, a throwaway account created that day, and a block of text that read like somebody had typed it fast and not gone back. My friend went in 3 days ago. He said that he found a way into the old Harwick facility off Route 9 past the county line. I have the coordinates that he sent to me. He kept texting updates for the first hour and then the messages stopped except for one at 2 in the morning when he just said, "The lower levels aren't on any of the floor plans that I found. There's something wrong with the way the tunnels are laid." That was it. Cut off mid-sentence. I read it twice. My first assumption was ARG, an alternate reality game, some elaborate thing with planted accounts and fake distress signals. The writing had that quality to it. The kind of breathless urgency that usually means someone put a lot of effort into making it look effortless. I almost kept scrolling, but then I copied the coordinates into Google Maps because I was already awake and there was nothing else to do, and the pin landed on a real place. A result from a historical preservation database. Harwick Signal Processing Facility, decommissioned in 1987. Federal ownership transferred to county land management in 1993. There was one photograph attached to the record. Concrete structures half buried, chain link perimeter fencing. The photo was dated 2004. I went back to the thread. Someone 3 replies down had written, "The eastern access point has been sealed since at least 2019. I drove out there last fall. If this is real, those seals are open." Another reply under that. "Check the second access on satellite. Something's different." And then a reply from the original poster, timestamped 4 hours after the first. "He still hasn't answered. I don't know what to do." I sat with that for a minute. The lamp flickered. And then I refreshed the page and the thread was gone. Not deleted with a mod note, not locked, just gone like it had never been there. I checked my browser history. I clicked back through it and got a Reddit 404. The throwaway account came up as suspended when I searched for the username directly. I should have gone to sleep. I know that, but instead I sat there at my desk while my phone died and thought about the coordinates, which I had already written down on the back of a gas station receipt, because I have a habit of doing that. And I thought about the last message cutting off mid-sentence. And I thought about the reply saying the access point shouldn't be open. I left at 5:30 in the morning. I'm not reckless. I want to be clear about that because what comes next is going to sound like I am. I packed deliberately and took my time doing it. I found the Streamlight flashlight that I had bought 2 years ago for a camping trip that I ended up not taking, and checked the batteries and packed 2 sets of spares in a Ziploc bag and put that in the front pocket of my backpack where I could get to it fast. Water, energy bars, a paper printout of everything that I could find about the facility in the hour that I spent searching before I left. I had the screenshot of the coordinates and I had a rough idea of the layout from a military base decommissioning document that I found on a government archive site. 2 above-ground levels, at least 1 sub-level, connected by a central stairwell. The gun, I debated for longer than I want to admit. It's a Glock 19 that I've had for 3 years. I've put probably 4,000 rounds through it at the range. I'm not careless with it, I keep it cleaned and I know how it works. I stood in my kitchen holding it and I thought, you're going to a place where somebody might be hurt and needs help, or you're going to a place where something is wrong in a way that you don't understand yet. Either way, I took it. I holstered it on my hip under my jacket, not in the bag, somewhere that I could reach it without thinking. I drove out, and just as it was getting light. Route 9 past the county line is the kind of road that used to go somewhere and now just connects two stretches of nothing. The gravel access track wasn't marked. I almost missed the turnoff and had to reverse 30 feet to find it. And it was rougher than it looked on satellite. Deep ruts that bottomed out my car twice before I parked under a stand of scrub pines and got out. The air smelled like damp soil and something faintly metallic underneath, though I wasn't sure yet if that was the facility or just the morning. The fence was chain link, 8 feet, and it had been cut. The edges of the cut section had oxidized to a dull brown, and the flap had been folded back and more or less stayed there, bent into shape by repeated use. I went through it crouching, my backpack catching once on a wire, and I came out on the other side into a lot that had been paved at some point and wasn't anymore. The asphalt buckled and split by decades of frost and root growth. There were 4 concrete structures visible from where I stood. 2 looked like equipment housings, low and lidded, the kind of thing you would see at a water treatment plant. One was bigger, maybe 20 by 40 feet, with narrow rectangular windows that had been bricked in. The 4th was partially buried in the hillside to the north, just a facade of poured concrete with a heavy door at the center. The warning signage was still there, mounted to posts that had rusted through at the base and leaned at angles that made them mostly illegible. I could read "Authorized personnel" on one and "trespassing" on another, and that was about it. The ground between the structures was overgrown, hip-high grass gone dry and yellow, and the whole place had the quality of somewhere that had been left alone long enough that nature was in the middle of deciding whether to absorb it or not. Not dramatic decay, just a slow and indifferent erasure. The bunker door on the hillside was the one from the photograph. It was a sloped steel door, double panel, set into the concrete at about a 30-degree angle, and it was open. Not all the way, maybe 18 inches. Enough to get through it if I went sideways. And it had been open long enough that the edges had started to corrode where they met the frame. I stood in front of it for a moment. There was nothing really ominous about it. It was just a door that was open when it probably shouldn't be. I looked back once, the way that I had come. The pines, the gravel track, the gray morning sky with some low cloud cover moving in from the west. And then I turned on the stream light, angled myself sideways, and I went in. And the air changed immediately. It dropped maybe 10 degrees in the space of a step, and the stale quality of it was hard to describe. Not rotting, more like sealed, like the air in a room that had been closed for years and then opened. There was something metallic underneath it, faint. The sound changed too. The ambient outdoor noise cutting off almost completely the moment that I had cleared the door, replaced by a low silence that had a density to it, if that makes sense. Like the quiet in the room after a sound stops. I paused, and just inside to let my eyes adjust to the flashlight beam. Stone steps descended about 15 feet to a landing and then continued. The walls were poured concrete, rough with conduit running along the left side and a handrail on the right that had pulled partially away from the wall. I tested the first step with my weight and then the second. They were solid. I went down. Behind me, the door shifted. I heard it, a low scraping sound as it moved maybe an inch further closed. I turned and looked at it. It sat slightly more closed than before, probably just from the pressure change of me entering. I watched it for a few seconds and it didn't move again. I turned back and kept going. The first level was offices. A central hallway maybe 60 feet long with doors on both sides, most of them opened, a few pulled shut. The floors were linoleum, gray and green, coated in dust that had settled so evenly and completely that it looked like paint. I moved slowly, checking each room as I passed. Standard office furniture, metal desks, filing cabinets, rolling chairs overturned or shoved into corners. One room still had paper in a wire basket on the desk, fused together by moisture and time into a single, solid mass. Another had a bulletin board on the wall with a few papers, a thumbtack to it, unreadable. The dust on everything was undisturbed. Perfectly, uniformly undisturbed. And that layer of settled time that tells you nobody has been in a room for a very long while. I was taking inventory in a way, I think, cataloging the ordinary to reassure myself. This is just a building. This is just a place where people used to work. The second level was accessed through a stairwell at the end of the hall, and it was different in the way that institutional spaces are different from each other. Same materials, different function. Barracks mostly. A long room with bed frames lined up, mattresses either gone or rotted through, personal storage lockers along one wall. Some of the lockers were open and some were closed. One had a boot inside it, a single combat boot. The leather gone stiff and the laces snapped. On the floor near the far end of the room there was a playing card face down in the dust. I didn't pick it up. Another room off the barracks had shelving units, half of them collapsed, and wooden crates that had broken apart under their own weight over the years. Standard stores, most of it unidentifiable now. I found a sign mounted above a doorway that read, "Lower Complex Access, Authorized Personnel Only, Level 3 Clearance Required." The door beneath it was locked, and the elevator shaft was around the corner from it. The doors closed, and when I tried them, firmly sealed. I could get my fingers in the gap, but nothing moved. But there was a stairwell door next to the elevator, and that one opened. I stood in the doorway and I pointed the flashlight down. The stairs continued in a single straight run, no switchback, descending maybe 30 feet to where the beam ran out of reach. The air coming up from below was heavier, not colder exactly, but heavier, like a column of air had more weight to it. I held my hand near the gap and I felt a faint movement, not a draft exactly, more like pressure equalizing slowly. I had the handgun ready and I started down. The stairwell was narrower than the ones above. My shoulders were close to both walls simultaneously, and the ceiling dropped a foot or so partway down, which I noticed by almost hitting my head. The sound of my footsteps was close and echoless, absorbed by the concrete rather than bouncing back, which was disorienting in a low-grade way I noticed without being able to fully articulate. About 2/3 of the way down I slowed. The dust pattern was wrong. On the levels above, the dust was even. Years of settled accumulation, flat and uniform. Here it was different. The center of each step had less buildup, and along the edges where the step met the wall there were smudge marks, irregular like something had brushed against the wall repeatedly in the same spots. My mind translated it slowly. Foot traffic. Recent enough that the dust hadn't resettled. Recent enough to matter anyway. I stopped on the landing and crouched to look more carefully. A footprint, partial, in the thin layer of dust on the landing floor. Boot tread, heel, and a partial midfoot. The toe end obscured by a scuff mark. I didn't recognize the pattern as matching my own boot, and I hadn't come this far yet anyway. The thought that I had was direct and not complicated. Somebody came down here recently and this place hasn't been abandoned the way that I thought it was. I held the information and stood there in the silence and listened to it more carefully than I had been. I kept going down. The corridor at the bottom was long, longer than anything on the levels above, and it ran straight into the edge of my flashlight beam, which in this space felt like a shorter distance than it actually was. The ceiling was lower here, maybe 7 feet, and the conduit along the walls was heavier gauge and more of it, bundled in places and running in several directions. Institutional green paint on the walls, chipped and damp in places where moisture had found a way in. The dust on the floor here was disturbed in a path down the center of the corridor. Not footprints exactly, more like a general displacement, as though something had moved repeatedly through the space and the dust had been pushed aside and not resettled. I kept to the edge of the corridor, both to avoid stepping in the disturbance and out of an instinct that I didn't fully examine. The wall scraping marks started about 30 feet in. They were at shoulder height or roughly shoulder height, irregular, some shallow, some cut deeper into the paint and the concrete beneath, horizontal in orientation but not consistent, not like a pipe had been dragged along the wall, more like something with multiple contact points had moved against it. I touched one with 2 fingers. The edges were dry and had collected a thin layer of fine dust, which told me they weren't made this morning but didn't tell me much else. 20 feet further, the path on the floor widened and changed character. 2 tracks now parallel with heavier displacement. Drag marks. Something heavy had been moved through here, repeatedly or once in a way that required a significant force. I crouched down and moved the flashlight beam slowly along the floor, and the shape of it was clear. 2 channels maybe 2 feet apart, continuous. I followed them with my eyes as far as the beam reached, and then I saw the smear on the wall and I initially registered it as rust. The facility had enough oxidation on the hardware and conduit fittings that it was plausible, and I kept moving for another 2 or 3 steps before something made me stop and go back to it. It was at arm height on the right wall. I put the flashlight close to it. The color was wrong for rust. Rust goes orange and then brown and then almost black over time. And this was darker at the edges and had the kind of peripheral smearing pattern that rust doesn't make. I touched the edge of it with 1 finger. Dry, old enough to be dry, but the color when I licked at my fingertip was a dark rust red, and I stood there for a moment and accepted what I was looking at. Blood. Old blood, but blood. I wiped my finger on my jeans and kept moving. I mean, what else was I going to do? And the blood became more frequent past that point, and the pattern of it changed. First, small drops on the floor, the kind that fall from a wound while somebody is moving rather than standing still. Then smears on the wall irregular at different heights, which meant whatever made them was moving in an uncontrolled way, stumbling or being moved. A handprint on the left wall, complete, palm and fingers at about chest height, and then a second handprint lower like somebody sliding down. The handprints were human-sized and that registered as a specific kind of reassurance that lasted about 10 seconds before I noticed the third mark, which was also a handprint but larger. The palm spread too wide and the fingers disproportionately long, outside the range of normal human proportions. I stopped and looked at it for a moment. I was aware of my breathing. I tried to keep it even. The sound started while I was still crouched near the handprint, faint at the far edge of hearing, filtered through a lot of concrete, a groaning but not consistent. It came in bursts, 3 or 4 seconds of sound and then a gap and then more. It was wet somehow. The quality of it had a moisture to it, like the sound was coming through tissue as much as through air. I stood up slowly and didn't move. My hand was already moving to the gun before I made a conscious decision about it, fingers finding the grip. I stood in the corridor and listened, and the sound came again, further down and then again, and I waited through 4 or 5 cycles of it with my hand on the gun and the flashlight pointed at the middle distance. The corridor stayed empty. Whatever was making the sound wasn't in it or wasn't visible in the corridor, which at that moment felt like an important distinction. I drew the gun and held it at a low ready, and I started walking again. The corridor opened into a junction room at what I estimated was about 120 feet from the stairwell. The ceiling went up here maybe 12 feet and the space was maybe 30 feet across. A hub, the kind of room where hallways from multiple directions converge. There were 3 other corridor openings visible, 2 on the far side and 1 to my left. My flashlight caught it before I understood what I was seeing, which is its own kind of experience, the data arriving before the interpretation. The beam swept across something in the right half of the room and I stopped walking, and I let the light sit on it and I stood there for probably 5 seconds just processing. At first, it looked like insulation. The room had some collapsed ceiling sections in the upper levels, and there was loose material and debris in places, and my brain made that guess quickly. But insulation doesn't stretch between walls. Insulation doesn't have that quality of tension, that taut anchoring at multiple points. What I was looking at was fibrous and red, not red like rust and not red like paint. Red in a way that living tissue was red, and it was stretched across most of the right side of the room in thick strands, anchored to the wall on one side and to the section of the exposed conduit rack on the other, and to the ceiling at multiple points that I couldn't fully map. The strands were thick in places, finger width, and in other places thinner, almost translucent, and they caught the flashlight beam in a way that made the whole structure seem faintly luminescent at the edges. I stood at the entrance to the room and I looked at it, and then I saw the man inside it. He was suspended maybe 3 feet off the ground. The webbing, I'm going to call it webbing because I don't have another word, it was wrapped around him in a way that wasn't random. The strands running under his arms and across his chest and around his legs in a pattern that looked almost structural, like a specific configuration rather than something that had grown around him. His clothes were partially visible, dark jacket, jeans, 1 boot. The strands crossed his face in 2 places, which is the detail that I remember most clearly. He was tilted slightly backward, head dropped toward his left shoulder. He was twitching. Small movements, rapid, primarily in his hands and in the muscles of his shoulders. The kind of movement that didn't correspond to breathing and didn't correspond to any deliberate action. Just small, continuous, and involuntary movement. His chest was rising and falling, so he was still alive. But the twitching had a different rhythm than the breathing. It was unrelated to it. The groaning was coming from him. I understood that now. It came in those bursts, not because something was intermittent, but because he was exhaling in bursts, pressure-driven, like the process of breathing was only partially under his control. I took a step into the room. My flashlight was on him and I was watching the webbing, looking for movement in it. Because if this structure was biological, then it might respond to stimulation, and I wasn't going to step into the middle of it without knowing that. The webbing didn't move. The man's twitching continued. I took another step and my angle changed and I could see his face more clearly. His eyes were open and they were tracking me. Not turned toward me, but tracking, following my movement as I came closer, the eyes moving slowly in the sockets. His mouth opened slightly as I got within 10 feet of him. The movement of his jaw was slow and effortful, like moving through resistance, and nothing came of it except a change in the quality of the sound. The groaning shifted slightly. It became something with more shape to it, the way that sound becomes speech before it becomes words. I had the thought, very quickly and without spending much time on it. He's trying to tell me something and he can't. I had a second thought immediately after, which was that I needed to understand the structure of what he was in before I went any closer, because stepping into a system that I didn't understand would be the kind of mistake that didn't fix itself. Something shifted in the webbing. Not a lot, just a slight change in tension. A tremor that moved through several strands at once, outward from somewhere toward the upper right portion of the structure where the strands were anchored to the ceiling. The man's twitching changed quality. It became more agitated. His mouth opened further and his eyes stayed on me. The screech was immediate and directionless, which is the worst quality a sound can have in an enclosed space. I couldn't locate it. I couldn't determine if it was coming from above me or behind the webbing or from one of the corridor openings. And in the half second that I spent trying to determine that, the movement started. It came off the ceiling, or it had been on the ceiling and I hadn't seen it because the flashlight had been on the man, and I hadn't swept the upper register of the room carefully enough. It dropped to the webbing first, landing on it with enough weight that the whole structure shuddered and the man inside it convulsed sharply, and then it oriented toward me. I want to describe it accurately because I've been over it many times since and I want to be precise. The body was wrong from the first moment. Too many joints in the limbs and the limbs themselves arranged at angles that legs and arms shouldn't make, the way that an insect is constructed rather than the way that a vertebrae is. It was larger, maybe 4 feet at the body, and the abdomen was swollen and asymmetrical, heavier on one side. The limbs I counted as 6 in the first second, might have been more. They were long and jointed twice, and they gripped the webbing and the wall surface with a faculty that came from having the right kind of anatomy for that, not from effort. The head was attached to the abdomen, and I mean that specifically. Not to the front of the body where a head should be, but to the swollen underside of the abdomen, the face pointing downward and outward. The skin of the face was stretched over the underlying structure in a way that skin isn't supposed to stretch, tight in some places and loose in others, and the face was recognizable as a human face. The eyes moved, independently of each other and independently of the direction that the body was oriented. The eyes moved. The mouth was moving too, the lips making slow, repeated shapes, and the sound coming from it was a low, nearly continuous murmur underneath the main sound that the creature was producing. It adjusted its position on the webbing. 2 limbs lifted, repositioned, set down again. The head rotated toward me slightly, the eyes finding me in a way that involved turning the eyes rather than the face. And then it went still. I don't know how long the pause lasted, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5. It was oriented toward me and it was looking at me, and it was absolutely still except for the movement of the mouth and eyes. The webbing around the man trembled with a low, continuous vibration. The man's twitching had become something closer to a full-body convulsion, rhythmic, coordinated with a pattern that I couldn't identify. And then it moved. I fired twice before I was fully conscious of having made the decision to fire. Both shots were at the body mass, and the sound of the shots in that room was like a physical impact. I felt it in my chest and in my sinuses, and the echoes didn't resolve cleanly. They just accumulated. I don't know if I hit it. The creature was already moving when I fired, and it moved in a way that I have trouble tracking in memory. Not fast in a linear sense, more like it had multiple options and it was using all of them. 2 limbs on the wall and 2 on the ceiling, and 1 or 2 on the webbing structure, and it was using all of those pathways at once, which made tracking it with a gun almost impossible. I backed up and my heel caught something on the floor. I looked down for 1 second and it was a smear of blood and my boot had gone through it, and I nearly went down. I caught myself on the wall with my left hand and I pushed off and got moving again. The junction room was behind me and I was back in the corridor. The 3rd shot I fired was at the ceiling junction where the corridor met the room, in the direction of movement. And when I fired it, I heard a sound from behind me, from a man in the webbing, that I won't describe in detail except to say that it wasn't pain. It was the wrong kind of sound for pain. It was more like a response, like a signal. The creature dropped from the ceiling to the floor of the corridor. It hit wrong. 1 limb buckled and it scrabbled to right itself, which was the only time it moved inelegantly. And in that second, I was moving fast and I had maybe 30 feet of a lead. The thing about running in a 7-foot ceiling concrete corridor with a flashlight is that the light doesn't go around the person carrying it. So every time I turned to check behind me, I lost the beam in front of me for a moment and ran blind for 2 or 3 steps. I did this twice. Both times the beam came back to empty corridor, but the sound of movement behind me, limbs on concrete, a scraping that was both limb tips and the bulk of the body brushing the wall. It was continuous and not far enough away. I hit a side corridor on the right that I didn't remember from my way in. The decision to take it was more spatial than strategic. It was there and I was already past the turn and I took it and committed. This corridor was shorter and ended in a T-junction that wasn't on my mental map of the facility at all, which told me that I had gone wrong somewhere in my orientation. Maybe when I had been moving sideways in the junction room, maybe just from the adrenaline compressing my spatial memory. I stood at the T-junction and the streamlight chose that moment to flicker. 1, 2, 3, a strobe that lasted maybe 2 seconds. And in the gaps, I was in complete and total darkness, and the sound of movement behind me was coming from the corridor that I had just come down. The flashlight came back. I took the left passage and I committed to it. The left passage bent slightly after about 20 feet and opened into another corridor that I recognized. The conduit arrangement on the ceiling was the same as what I had walked under on the way in. Heavier gauge bundled to the left, single runs breaking off every 10 feet or so. I was back on the main stretch, or close to it, and I could feel the direction of the stairwell even if I couldn't see it yet. Behind me, from somewhere in the side passage, I heard a sound that was different from the limb scraping. It was the human sound, the murmur from the face on the abdomen, but louder now and with a rhythm to it. And underneath it there was a wet clicking that I associated with the mouth moving too fast and too much. And then it layered back into the scraping, closer, and I stopped trying to map it and just run. The stairwell door was where I had left it. I hit it with my shoulder and it opened and I was on the stairs taking them fast. Hand on the rail because the flashlight was bouncing and the steps were irregular, and a fall here would be the end of it. I stumbled 4 steps from the top, my knee hitting the edge of a step hard enough that I felt it all the way to my hip, and I grabbed the rail and hauled myself up and through the doorway at the top. The second level. Barracks, storage, the boot in the locker. I kept moving. The sounds from below had changed. The scraping had stopped and been replaced by something else. a resonance that came through the floor rather than through the air, like movement translated into vibration in the concrete. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer. I moved like it was. First level offices, filing cabinets, the dust that I had thought was reassuring 40 minutes ago. The main corridor at a run, my footsteps loud and unavoidable. The stairway up to the entrance. I went up the stairs 3 at a time with my hand dragging along the right wall for contact and orientation. And then the door in the gray morning light and the cool damp air outside hitting my face like surfacing from water. I was through the door and 10 feet out before I slowed down. And then I stopped. I stood in the overgrown lot between the concrete structures and I breathed and I listened. The outside sounds came back. Wind in the dry grass, a bird somewhere in the pines, distant road noise from Route 9. The door behind me sat slightly more open than I had left it, maybe from my coming through, and I watched it for a long moment. The dark behind it was just the dark inside a building with no windows, I told myself, and the door sat still. I walked back through the cut fence to where I had parked. My knee was starting to register properly now, a deep bruise at minimum, and my hands were shaking in a way that had started at some point in the last few minutes and hadn't stopped. I sat in the driver's seat and set the gun on the passenger seat and put both hands flat on my thighs, and I worked on breathing normally until the shaking had reduced to something manageable. And then I drove. I didn't look at the facility in the rearview. I just drove. I was home by 9 in the morning. I changed my clothes and made coffee that I didn't drink, and I sat at the desk where I had been sitting when I had first read the thread. And I went through the sequence of events in my head while it was still fresh, trying to encode the physical details before they faded or got contaminated by the way that memory works, by the way the brain starts to work on things and smooth the rough edges into something more coherent than what actually happened. I thought about the original post, the friend who went in 3 days ago, the text cutting off. I thought about the thread being deleted while I was reading it, and whether that was a coincidence or wasn't. I was pulling off my jacket when I noticed it. On the right sleeve, near the cuff, there was a strand, thin, maybe 4 inches long, and the same red as what I had seen in the junction room. I must have brushed against some part of the webbing without registering it. I pinched it between my thumb and finger and tried to roll it off the fabric. It didn't come loose. The texture of it was slightly tacky and it had caught in the weave of the jacket in a way that wasn't immediately separable from just pulling at it. I pinched harder and pulled and it stretched. It stretched considerably further than a 4-inch strand should stretch, thinning as it extended, becoming almost translucent at maximum extension. And I kept waiting for it to snap, and it didn't snap until I had pulled it almost a full foot from where it had been attached to the sleeve. The end of it, when it finally gave, curled back in on itself slightly before going still. I put the jacket in a garbage bag and put the garbage bag outside the apartment door. I showered and tried to eat something, and I mostly managed it. I told myself what had happened had a physical explanation even if I didn't have all of it yet. That whatever I had seen was a thing that existed in the world and could therefore be understood. And that the man in the webbing might be retrieved by somebody with more resources and preparation than I had. That there were people who needed to know about the facility. I sent an email. I don't know who to exactly. I found a contact address for a federal land management office and wrote a brief account, and I sent it, and I don't know what happens to those emails or if anybody reads them. But I saved the coordinates in 3 places. I went to sleep around noon. The sleep was heavy and without dreams. The kind of sleep that comes after sustained adrenaline. and I woke up a little past 10 in the evening to the room dark and my phone showing a string of notifications that I hadn't gotten to yet. I lay in the dark for a moment, coming back to full consciousness slowly and then faster than I wanted to, and the room was quiet. The refrigerator, the road noises, somebody's TV through the ceiling 2 floors up. The normal inventory of a normal apartment at night. And I ran through it the way you do when you're checking that everything is where it should be, which it was, which should have been enough. And then, just at the edge of hearing from somewhere further in the apartment, the bathroom maybe, or the small utility space behind the kitchen where the water heater was, a sound. Low and wet. It came in a burst of 3 or 4 seconds, and then went quiet and then came again. I lay in the dark and I didn't move and I listened to it, and the second time that it came I was more certain about what it was than I wanted to be. And the third time it came I identified something underneath it, faint, layered into the main sound, that had a rhythm and a shape that I recognized. I got up, I got the gun off the nightstand and I turned on the lamp, and I stood in the bedroom doorway looking down the hall at the dark at the end of it. And I stood there for a long time before I did anything else.